Hi friends, Father Kerry Walters here, pastor of Holy Spirit American National Catholic Church, and this is another Holy Spirit moment. This one on a little-known mass peace movement that took place in the Middle Ages. For the past 2 weeks, you and I have watched with increasing horror and sorrow and perhaps anger the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We have seen hospitals and apartment buildings, private residences and schools bombarded. We've seen hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian refugees fleeing their war-torn nation. We've seen the valiant resistance of Ukrainian soldiers to the Russian invaders. We've seen men and women and non-combatant children killed in the fighting. We've seen cities encircled and their water supplies and their electricity and their food stopped. And we have been reminded once again in all of this devastation of just how horrible warfare is. And we've also been reminded of something else, thank God. We've been reminded that deep within each and every one of us is embedded a longing for peace, a longing for the welfare of all human beings to not be ravaged by warfare. This longing for peace is endemic, I believe, to humanity. And we see instances of it throughout the history of humanity. And one of the most bright and shining instances of this longing, I believe, occurred in the 10th and 11th centuries in Western Europe. Because at that time, a massive peace movement erupted in response to the violence that was roiling throughout Europe. It had two prongs. One was called the Peace of God movement, the Pax Dei, and it began in the last quarter of the 10th century. And the other prong was called the Treuga Dei, the Truce of God movement, and it began in the first third of the next century, of the 11th century. The Peace of God movement began in the wake of the disintegration of Charlemagne's empire. Charlemagne was the first king who managed to consolidate Europe since the breakdown of the Roman Empire some 3 or 4 centuries earlier. Charlemagne was declared emperor in the year AD 800, and he dies 14 years later. During his long reign, however, he managed to more or less effect a time of peace throughout his empire. When he died, however, he left his empire to his 3 sons. History tells us that that's almost always a mistake, even though it looks good on paper, because if an empire or a kingdom is left to more than one ruler, squabbling and civil war almost inevitably breaks out. And so it happened amongst Charlemagne's sons, setting in motion the disintegration of the entire empire, such that a century after Charlemagne's death, what had once been a more or less peaceful Europe had broken down into a number of squabbling feudal fiefdoms. Little knights and their little principalities began to fight one another in an interminable series of vendettas and feuds. And the fighting, of course, affected everyone, including perhaps most horribly the peasantry, who had to endure the violence that was going on around them. It's because of that violence that affected everyone that the Peace of God movement was inspired. Its earliest expression seems to have been in the year AD 975, when a church council was called at Le Puy. And that council determined that if any violence was inflicted upon either ecclesial property or people who were ordained in the church, that the inflictors of the violence would be excommunicated. This was believed to be a necessary deterrence to the violence that even church people and church property were beginning to feel. It wasn't long, however, before this peace of God, which was proposed explicitly for the church, began to spread. So before long, the peace of God extended to the poor peasantry who had suffered so badly, but also to townspeople and also to craftspeople and all of their possessions. Council after council after council in the next 70 years met to declare that the peace of God had to be honored by these squabbling knights, by these petty little fiefdoms. And pretty soon, what the church had started became a mass movement. And at each of these councils, thousands of people from all different classes of Europe would congregate, all shouting, "Pax, Pax, Pax, we demand peace." And at these meetings, the relics of saints would be brought, and the saints would be asked for intercession, such that peace might fall upon the land. It's interesting, people who came to these mass movements seemed to ignore the caste system that was endemic to Europe at the time. Noblemen rubbed shoulders with peasants. Tradespeople rubbed shoulders with priests. They were all united in a desire for the violence to end. And they were also united in the suspicion that the violence was as awful as it was because of their own sins. That's why they would bring the relics of saints to the meetings and ask for the saints' intercession with God, because they were convinced that their sins had brought upon them the wrath of God. And in asking the saints to intercede for them, they also vowed to clean their acts up, to cease the petty squabbling in their own ranks, and to vow to conform to the peace of Christ that the book of Revelation, for example, tells us will come about in the final days. These meetings were so influential that bishops throughout Europe began to insist that peace was exactly what everyone needed to practice. And in fact, some of them went even further. Bishop Fulbert of Chartres, for example, in the first third of the 11th century, went so far as to say, contrary to church tradition, that there was no such thing as a just war, that killing under any circumstances was always wrong. And he decreed in his domain that any Christian who participated in war, even in a just war, would have to do penance for at least a year, and the penance would be quite rigorous. Along with other bishops, Fulbert also said this: no Christian is allowed to shed the blood of a fellow Christian, because doing so sheds the blood of Christ. Now, in the beginning of the 11th century, in the first third of the 11th century, in another effort to end the violence that was still going on in Europe despite the influence of the peace of God, the Treuga Dei, or the Truce of God, was devised. The Truce of God mandated that at certain times violence could not be perpetrated. The peace of God had mandated that violence couldn't be perpetrated against people or their possessions. The Truce of God insisted in its original formulation that no violence could be perpetrated between Saturday night and Monday morning. And the purpose was to keep the Sabbath holy and inviolate. But it wasn't long before the extension of that particular period was from Wednesday night to Monday morning. And it wasn't long after that that the Truce of God also included major feast days, the holy seasons of Lent and Advent, feast days of the apostles. By the middle of the 11th century, the Truce of God had forbade violence on so many dates that there were really only about 80 days left in the calendar year where violence was permitted. Now, needless to say, the Truce of God and before it, the Peace of God, were not totally successful. There were knights and there were lords of fiefdoms who simply refused to honor, regardless of what the excommunication might be. As a matter of fact, it has been argued, and I think persuasively, that the Truce of God was instigated because the Peace of God movement was beginning to break down. And it certainly is the case that the Truce of God movement seems to, in one way or another, have been one of the inspirations for the First Crusade, which would be launched at the end of the 11th century. If we may not shed the blood of fellow Christians, then perhaps we can shed the blood of infidels. But my friends, while they lasted, they really did express the greatest hope and yearning of humans for peace. And they represented a time in which the caste system in Europe was at least temporarily forgotten, and people came together from all walks of life to try and earnestly prepare the breaches of peace that was perpetrated in their time, and to pledge their loyalty to the Prince of Peace. I so wish that Christians throughout the world today would revive the peace of God, and that, for example, Christians in Russia would refuse to attack Ukrainians, or that Christians in any nation would refuse to attack other nations, knowing that doing so was a violation of their fidelity to the Prince of Peace. I'm Father Kerry Walters, and this has been another Holy Spirit moment. Please, my friends, would you pray earnestly for peace in the days to come? And if you are able, would you please donate what you can to help Ukrainian refugees?